Hello, welcome to Into the Fire, a Burning Coal Theater Company podcast series.
Hi, this is Jerome Davis. I'm the artistic director of Burning Coal Theater Company, and I'd like to welcome everyone to Into the Fire, the Burning Coal Theater Company podcast series on all things theatrical. We have a very special guest today, Professor Carole Stabile, who is at the University of Oregon. Is that right, Carole?
That's right.
And what is your area of expertise there? Do you have a specific area that you focus on?
Yeah, I study media history, and my focus is really Cold War broadcasting.
And do you focus primarily on the United States, or are you looking at um, other places where the media was part of that era?
Mm-hmm. My focus is primarily the United States, but it is, as you know, many people in film, television, and theater became expatriates. So to that extent, you also have to be looking at what's happening in places like Mexico City and in London and in Paris and all the other places where blacklisted people went to try to get work.
But the primary blacklist itself was happening in the United States. Is
Yeah.
that correct? We
Yeah,
didn't. That was one we didn't manage to export successfully, thankfully.
No,
There's Go
no,
ahead.
go ahead, Jerome.
Well, I was going to mention Sam Wanamaker as an example of that. Is that a story you're familiar with? The sort of B-list film actor uh, from Hollywood.
Yeah, I'm a little familiar. I'm a slightly familiar with him. I'm more familiar with people who are writers, Ring Lardner Jr., Adrian
Yes.
Scott, who is part of the Hollywood 10, and other folks like that who went to or who got writing jobs, in
Trumbo.
England. Yeah, Trumbo,
Yeah.
yeah,
Douglas.
people like that.
Yeah. Well, Wanamaker, this might be of interest to you for future reference.
Yeah.
While he was over there trying to get work as an actor, looked up one day, looked around, and said, "Hey, how come you've never rebuilt the globe?" And he is the man who while he was there, created what is now called Shakespeare's Globe on the South Bank.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So something good came out of the blacklist, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the other thing that came out of the blacklist was Hannah Weinstein, who was a film producer in Hollywood,
Right.
left the United States and went to England and founded Sapphire Studios, which was pretty much single-handedly responsible for the costume drama craze of
Uh,
the 1950s, right? So she was the person who produced Robin Hood because Robin Hood was a little bit too hot a property for the United States in 1952.
because of the rob from the rich and give to the poor thing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
imagine. Yeah, sure. That's interesting too. Yeah, I didn't know that. So how did you get interested in that field? You're
Mhm.
obviously not old enough to have lived through that era. So what piqued your interest there?
Well, I was really thinking, and this goes back quite a few years about the ways in which different tropes of family were mobilized by political parties in the United States, and I was kind of interested in the origins of those forms of storytelling, right? So in the early 1990s, why were we telling a particular story about a kind of monolithic American family, and where did those forms of storytelling come from? Because it seemed to me that whenever pundits or politicians talked about the American family, they didn't talk about their own families, which were often not poster children for the American family they were promoted. They looked to television and they looked to media. And there's a historian, her name is Stephanie Coontz, who said, there was this tendency to treat Leave It to Beaver as if it was a documentary
Uh-huh. Sure.
and not a television show. So I became really interested in, the conditions of production for those early television sitcoms, which are so influential for a generation. And that kind of led me directly to the Blacklist and to this really rich and vibrant moment in American television history where people are moving between theater and film and television and radio. And there are all these kind of utopian ideas about what television might be in the United States. So
Right.
that was kind of the route that led me to the Blacklist and to all the ways in which those alternative visions were actively being suppressed in the late 1940s.
Right. That's interesting. And did you focus in specifically on the film industry, or theater was less impacted, I
Yeah.
think,
Yep.
really, but film was your primary focus, I presume.
Yeah. Well, there's so much written about the blacklist in film, and pretty much everyone would recognize the phrase the Hollywood 10, even if they couldn't name the 10 themselves.
Right.
But it seemed like no one was really talking or thinking about how the blacklist impacted radio and television during that period. And so that was one of the reasons I really wanted to focus on television and kind of think about and document the campaigns of intimidation and retaliation that shaped the birth of American television.
Hmm. And you're talking about from a thematic standpoint, and I assume the use of television uh, to make to persuade the American public of certain ideas that the powered elites wanted us to be persuaded of. Is that the idea? Um, and can you give me examples of that if that's what you're thinking about?
Yeah, yeah. What I really started focusing in on was a coordinated effort to ensure that a particular vision of American identity, Americanism, and the American family was the one that would become dominant on television. So I think in the years leading up to the Blacklist, there's so much creative ferment around television, right? No one knows what a television show is going to be. No one knows if it's going to look like theater. Is it going to look more like film? And there are all these ideas um, about featuring the rich diversity of the United States. So you see people like Shirley Graham Du Bois, who Shirley Graham got her start in opera, and then was head of one of the Negro units of the Federal Theater Project in Chicago.
Right.
At every step of her career, though, and I think this is an important point when we think about the blacklist, is the blacklist didn't just happen in the latter part of the 1940s. The blacklist had been used against um, people of color in particular in and around theater and broadcasting since the 1930s. So every place that Shirley Graham went, she would become very successful. But at some point, the projects she would was involved in would get shut down.
Uh-huh.
Right. So, I mean, I don't need to tell you the history of the Federal Theater Project,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, which was just an incredible contribution to American culture, but gets shut down by the very forces that in the later 1940s begin to turn their attention to a medium that they know is going to be incredibly influential, and that's television.
Who are the people we're talking about? We use the word they a lot,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
are there specific examples of who was involved with that, and what was their objective? Was it purely a financial one, or was there some sort of ideology behind it that extended beyond the financial?
That's a great question because what I've really tried to avoid in my research is kind of slipping into conspiracy theories, right? Um,
Wow.
I think that there were organizational tendencies, and there was a lot also in motion in the late 1940s. So the kind of nucleus for the blacklist was in broadcasting in particular, and also in New York City, right? LA had its own kind of dynamics, but in New York City, there were three former FBI agents who'd cut their teeth in the New York FBI's infamous anti-red they're the infamous Red Squad. So it's these three men who are working for the FBI. They all leave the FBI in right after World War II and begin to work in this kind of new field of private security. So the FBI realizes that they've taken classified files from the FBI to start their business. So there's a little tension between the FBI and this group of men initially, but then the FBI, I think, realizes how useful they are politically. So they start a business called the American Business Consultants. It publishes one of the premier anti-communist newsletters called Counterattack. And Counterattack often had unfounded charges about people in government, people in theater, people in film and media, and claims that they were either members of the Communist Party or fellow travelers.
Because they
Um,
felt they were influential on large sections of the public.
could you? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Could you say?
Well, why go after somebody who may or
Yeah,
not have any political affiliations at all?
yeah, yeah. Well, you know what they said they had one of them, I think it was Kenneth Byerly, but I would have to check my notes. They talked about the third violinist theory. And the third violinist, they said, wasn't, in a direct position to influence anything. But they could influence the second violinist, who
Yeah,
could then influence the concertmaster, right?
right.
And so it was this theory of contamination, and again, Counterattack was published for several years before they published the newsletter that they're best known for, which is Red Channels. And Red Channels was the report on communist influence in radio and television, and that listed 151 people working in and around broadcasting, a lot of people from the theater. And for people from the theater, as you pointed out earlier, theater's a totally different economic model. There wasn't as much money in theater as there was in radio or television. Its influence wasn't understood by anti-communists to be as extensive. So theater remained a place, a kind of haven for many of these people, but it was a haven that often didn't pay very well, and that made it very, very difficult for people to make a living. Whereas, if you could get a gig in television that was pretty regular, you were all set. But a lot of labor leaders in theater, Actors Equity, the Radio Writers Guild,
Stage hands.
yeah, 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 yeah. AFTRA, they were all being surveilled by the FBI, and also, sort of regularly the subject of reports and counterattack about communist influence. So it's this capacious network. They're also working with the American Legion. The American Legion plays a really important role in the blacklist. They mobilize people in cities throughout the country to boycott productions, to write letters, to bring whatever influence they could to bear on censoring individuals, canceling productions, and otherwise, again, suppressing dissent.
And the fear was that the public would become interested in what had happened in Russia nearer to the turn of the century, and would start electing officials that were more in line with communism or at least socialism, and that was the bottom line: to keep those people out of office. Um, or did they? Was there a moral component to it? Were the churches involved? I know the
Yeah.
Catholic Church was
Yeah.
involved
Yeah.
out west.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. The Catholic Church was involved in the East as well. And they were an early funder of the American Business Consultants. The anti-China lobby was also supporting, this is a group of industrialists with business interests in China, who were very upset about what was happening there. But it was really the term progressive was very capacious in this era. So it was, there was this category of fellow travelers because actually, the number of people who were members of the Communist Party was quite low.
Right.
So there was this category called fellow traveler, and fellow traveler could include anyone, from Gertrude Berg, right, who is a new dealer, right, and also a consummate pitch person, right? She's as far from a communist as you can kind of get. But they all got caught up in this web, right? Because once you had been tarred with the this notion that you were in league with the Communist Party. And of course, Communist Party issues ranged from um, civil rights issues. So people who were engaged in various civil rights activities were automatically suspect. People who were mobilizing for peace, people who were critical of the use of nuclear weapons, all of these people became suspect, and tainted by the belief that these were communist issues. And even if they weren't aware that they were communist issues, these people were dupes, and they should have known better.
Do you think that the theater and film and television, um, which at the beginning of the 20th century had been a much different kind of art form, very, I guess, flimsy would be a good way to describe many of the offerings, or pageants, things like Ziegfeld Follies and
Mhm.
Busby Berkeley and all of that. A very lightweight entertainment in England. It was drawing room comedies, set on estates and wealthy people in smoking jackets, drinking champagne and making light, comedic retorts to each other. And I guess my question is, did what happened in Russia, um, the Bolshevik Revolution, and then what was happening there in China after the war, did all of that change the art? Did that inspire people like Arthur Miller to start writing about social issues more? Or do you think that was a natural evolution that would have happened regardless of what was happening in a geopolitical sense?
Well, I love theater, but I'm not a theater historian. I would say though that there is certainly a group of playwrights who are dealing with social issues, beginning in the Depression and moving forward, right? I think also of Lillian Hellman,
Right,
right?
definitely.
But also Odette's and people like that who are writing social issue content, across radio, for theater, and later for television, who are very interested in in exploring social issues. And certainly they're influenced, by what's happening in Russia, by what's happening in Europe during, before and during World War II. I think that the influence of Russia It's an interesting question, right? Because the way that we typically think about communism in the CP USA is if um, it's kind of interesting and contradictory, right? On one hand, we tend to look at the Communist Party as is hopelessly sectarian, and on the other hand, it's like they're the phrase was Stalin's little minions, right? They who moved in lockstep, right? They just took orders from the Soviet Union, and I think it's much more rich and complicated than that. I hope that someday that history gets told in all its complexity. I think that it's been in the shadow of anti-communism for so long that it's sometimes hard to sort that out, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, there's many complexities.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons I'm curious about that is that I think one thing we do pretty well in the West is look back,
Hmm.
but we don't maybe quite as often look at what's right in front of our noses. And so you had talked about this push on the part of powerful organizations and individuals to create a kind of a halcyon view of the American family
Mhm.
in the 1950s. If you look at television today or film, you see anything but that.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so I guess my question is, did they give up? Or is there a different tactic being taken? What is the current equivalent of that, do you think? Or is that something you've had time to think about?
No, I do think when I was writing my book about women in the blacklist, I thought it's really important that this is happening at the moment that television is taking shape as an industry. Because I do think some of the fear of the blacklist, some of um, the aversity to taking on risk and to taking on controversial ideas, I think that all gets embedded in the industry, and then it becomes a way of doing business. Now, or, I think the logic has always been, well, it doesn't make money, right? You can't sell this stuff, right? People don't want to see, and this was quite common in the 1940s and 1950s. People don't want to see people who don't look like them on television, right? Which is totally true and counter all the evidence we know. People loved the Goldbergs, which
Yeah,
is, a program that runs from the late 20s on radio into the early 50s on television about a Jewish family and
right,
who lives in a tenement in the Bronx and are very progressive kind of New Dealers. People love that. And wrote fan letters, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of fan letters saying how much they loved learning about Jewish culture and watching the Goldbergs. But the industry developed its own common sense about what it could sell and what it wanted to sell. And controversy became such a bad word, Jerome. I mean, you know, the real effect of the blacklist was to say we are going to avoid controversy at all costs because it is going to get us into so much trouble. It's going to cause no amount of mischief. And so then you just didn't, you didn't have immigrants on television, right? Because if immigrants on television was going to, get you blacklisted or draw the ire of anti-communists, who was going to touch it?
right.
So then for decades, it's interesting on television, the only immigrants you have are aliens,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Alf or
Yeah,
Mork,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
somebody like
yeah.
that. Although there was a little window in the 70s when it
Hmm.
felt like some experimentation
Hmm.
was going on there, often under the guidance of one individual,
Oh
like
yeah,
a Norman Lear, for instance.
yep,
But
yeah,
what I see today, the reason I asked that leading question, which I'm very good
yeah,
at doing, is that I see nothing but police shows on now. Everything on television is this cop or that CIA agent or this
yeah,
FBI team, almost as if we were being prepared for a police state. Um,
Yeah.
is that an overreach, do you think, on my part, an overreaction?
No, I don't think it is, right? Because police dramas and Law and Order was not controversial, right? If what you were worried about was the FBI breathing down your throat, and a network like CBS was, they had good reason. The FBI had informants at all levels
Right,
of CBS as an organization. And, who wanted to cross J. Edgar Hoover in
right,
1951, right?
right,
So, he, as long as the Law and Order shows took the perspective of law and order and not the people who were being policed, that was certainly not controversial.
right. And you almost never saw that. You almost never saw the people, or never see the people.
Yeah.
We get lots of stories about
Yeah.
this bad guy or this bad little group, but it's almost never from the top down, where in
Right.
the 70s we had Serpico, which was an extraordinary.
Oh, yeah.
But when was the last time we saw something like that on television or in film? It's very difficult to think of one that entered the zeitgeist in the way, for instance, that Serpico did back in the day.
Homicide, life on the streets.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, yeah, I think that's and that struggled to stay on the air uh,
right,
for many years.
right,
It is ironic, isn't it, that the only thing that was uncontroversial was violence and murder,
right, right. And
right?
that remains so.
Yeah,
Today, the violence is being ratcheted up more and more.
yeah.
Meanwhile, any semblance of anyone with a moral compass seems to be like the odd man out, so to speak, these days.
Well,
Or at least that's the way I read it. I do think the theater is lagging behind there, and maybe that's how it's been forever. But we do still have plays about people who make the right choice, and
that's right. Yeah,
um,
yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing is that the forces of the blacklist were very, very much opposed to government support for the arts.
right, right.
Right? I mean, that
That's a
was
communist.
always
Yeah.
that was always seen as a communist plot. And I
Yes.
think, I think that we see that in American culture now. Television and film, they're such cannibalistic media. I mean,
Right.
they thrive on remakes and they aren't, and they lack originality, right?
Very much. Yeah.
Which is a reason why we have, this kind of hegemony of the police procedural, even, in 2025. But I think it's important that part of that attack was on the idea of art that was supported by the government
Right.
and art that was critical of the government too, right? I mean, these were an incipient authoritarian regime that did not want to be criticized and did everything they could to shut down criticism. Now, I mean, as an academic, I love criticism. Criticism is what helps me grow, right? Criticism
Absolutely.
helps me, my writing gets better when people read it and disagree with me. But that is not something that these political forces wanted. The last thing they wanted was to be criticized, and to have to deal with that criticism publicly.
This was in an era principally when very strong-willed right-wing individuals. You mentioned J. Edgar Hoover, but the
Mhm.
Dulles brothers are the other
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
example of that, and their shadow continues to this day. Given all that's come out about the Dulles brothers, it is astonishing to me that we still have an airport named after one of them in our nation's capital. And that's true of the Hoover Building as well, the FBI headquarters, and so somehow they have managed, even beyond the grave, to hold on to a certain amount of power. we're starting to see changes, I think, and perhaps the recent election in New York City will have a good outcome. There
Yeah.
certainly will be extreme pressure on him to avoid the socialist route or to fail if he doesn't. But at least we've got somebody out on the track running. We'll see how he
Yeah.
finishes.
Yeah. Well, I think the other thing that's so important to keep in mind about the blacklist is the bravery of the artists who stood up to it.
He said no. Yeah, yeah,
And I think we forget about those stories. We forget about about people like I've been thinking a lot about Lillian Hellman lately, right? Who refused to name names
yep,
and who said very, very brave and important things in front of the HUAC. We forget about people like Adrian Scott and the men who produced that amazing film Salt of the Earth. Even after their lead actress was deported by
right,
the U.S. government. We think sometimes films get made about people like Trumbo. But there were so many people who really believed in an alternative vision of America and fought for it during those years. And we need examples like that right now.
right, right. I think Arthur Miller was one of them. He had a lot on the line,
Mhm. Yeah.
and and made the right choice, I think. And in David's play here in America, we also get to hear the argument from the other side, very forcefully stated, which I think is one of the things I personally like best about David as a playwright, is that he doesn't write propaganda. He really does wrestle with his own points of view, and the result is, I think, a quite wonderful play. Carole, thank you very much for your time. This has
Yeah. It
gone
was
by very
great
fast.
talking to you, Jerome. Yeah, yeah. My pleasure.
If you're ever down North Carolina way, come by and see us. We'll be getting into some kind of trouble, but
Good
but
for you. I would love to see the play. Thank you for letting me read it. It was really interesting. Yeah, yeah. And let me know when the podcast goes up.
I will do it. I will send you the link to it. And
Okay.
and thank you again.
It was a pleasure. Take care.
You too.